Hello, and thank you for joining us for another live stream here from Monticello. I'm Brandon Dillard, Manager of Historic Interpretation here, and today we'll be starting a conversation about indigenous history and politics as they relate to Jefferson, Monticello, and the early Republic of the United States. Today's topic is far too broad to cover in one brief conversation, and will likely just scratch the surface of this complex and rich subject. In spite of a narrative of American history that is often told as though everything began in 1492, the history of North America is far older and more complex. It began at least 12,000 years ago, although scholars argue on the origins and migrations of the first human inhabitants of these lands. And for millennia, the history and political structures of indigenous America developed and solidified through long processes of power, conflict, collaboration, and migration. Thousands of cultures and nations have come and gone, and thousands remain today. The post-colonial history of the Americas, it's a relatively recent development in the long view, but the past several centuries have had profound impacts on the course of humanity. When European colonists came to what they called the New World, they brought disease, warfare, alien ideas about religion and morality, and they created a concept that defined people by the colors of their skins and their regions of origins, a concept they called race that co-developed along with African slavery and ongoing wars against indigenous peoples. Centuries of conflict and struggle would follow, and by the time Thomas Jefferson was born in what his English people called Virginia, this conflict had been ongoing for 2.5 centuries. America was a very different place in the 18th century. Jefferson was born on what was considered a frontier, as far west as his British forebears had yet settled. His closest national neighbors were the Monacan, and he referenced the political dominance of the Iroquois to the north, the Cherokee, Muskogee to the south, and scores of other indigenous national entities on the eastern seaboard were still negotiating political sovereignty with the colonial powers of Europe. The American Revolution and the emergence of the United States brought even more change, and Native peoples in America were forced to continuously reassert their rights and reinvent how they survived in their own homelands. As an intellectual, Jefferson wrote about Native people. He cataloged languages. He collected Native art and artifacts, maps, and diplomatic gifts. He sought out more information about the people of the West for the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he had indigenous art and cultural artifacts displayed on the walls at Monticello. As a national leader, Jefferson helped establish the military and political power of the United States, and he helped to determine the new nation's policies towards American Indians. Today, we'll dig further into some of these subjects, and we'll talk about Jefferson's ideas and how early U.S. developments impacted Native America. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by an expert in Native legal and political affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David E. Wilkins. Dr. Wilkins is the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor in Leadership Studies at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. Professor Wilkins is a citizen of the Lumbee Nation of North Carolina. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he concentrates much of his work on Native politics and governance, with particular attention on the transformations that indigenous governments have been both coercively and voluntarily engaged in from pre-colonial times to the present. The concepts of Native sovereignty, self-determination, and diplomacy are at the heart of Wilkins' research and teaching, and he has focused much of his work on the political and legal relationships between Native nations and the intergovernmental affairs between Native peoples and states and Native peoples and the federal government. He's been a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, Harvard University, and Wake Forest University. He's the author or editor of a number of books, including Documents of Native American Political Development, Red Prophet, The Punishing Intellectualism of Vine Deloria Jr., and others. Before joining the University of Richmond, Dr. Wilkins was the McKnight Presidential Professor in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, where he also held appointments in law, political science, and American studies. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Wilkins. And I say we jump right in. So if you don't mind, just tell us a little more about yourself, your research, and your work.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm very happy to be joining you today. As you noted, I belong to the Lumbee Nation of North Carolina. I'm a citizen of that nation. We're the largest Native nation east of the Mississippi. Our population means that we're about the 5th largest tribe in the country. I was a military brat and spent much of my life traveling reservations, but they weren't native reservations, they were military reservations. But when I got into college, I began to read the works of Dillard Jr., who was the most powerful intellectual thinker of the time, and if not the century, and wound up studying under him for my master's degree. And he was the one that convinced me that we needed more indigenous people studying the political affairs of our nations and intergovernmental relations as well. And so that's what led me back to Chapel Hill to get my PhD. And then I began my teaching career at the University of Arizona for 9 years. And then the desert heat finally drove me away from there up to the cold Viking country in Minnesota, where I spent 20 winters and had a wonderful run there in both Native Studies, political science, and the law program as well. As you noted, my work really focuses on how indigenous peoples, how we've always governed ourselves, and how our governments were required to change because of the dominating influence of Western colonialism and all the forces that unleashed, along with other factors. And so I want to understand how we govern and how we relate intergovernmentally with the states, with the federal government. And increasingly, my work is looking at the global world as well. I teach courses on indigenous peoples at the global level because a lot of activities are happening now in the United Nations, and indigenous peoples around the world are meeting regularly and have been meeting regularly since the 1960s. And my wife and I are embarking on a textbook. It'll be a comparative politics textbook on indigenous peoples around the globe. But right now, my main work is a book on native governance that Oxford is going to publish. It's going to be sort of my big book, if you will, tracing how we govern pre-contact and how things have evolved from that point to the present time.
That's a fantastic segue, actually, to a good question here. You know, you're talking about these global, broad concepts and just important things that have to do with the whole cultural ramifications of humanity. And here at Monticello, we focus on a very specific historical period for the most part. And it mostly is this period of Jefferson's life that bridges the mid-18th century to the early 19th century. And during that time, indigenous peoples in America saw major changes in both colonial encroachment on their traditional homelands, and of course later with the emergence of the United States itself, a new nation state that forever alters how they interact with settler societies. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that your new book that you're working on starts sort of before that. So could you speak a little bit about pre-American, pre-United States, and pre-colonial indigenous politics?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly how many Native nations there were prior to European arrival. They estimate somewhere between 600 to 650. The best population figures that we have today say that there were somewhere between 7 to 12 million Native peoples living in what we now call the continental United States. And they range widely from very small fishing communities in the Northwest to the large Plains tribes in the Plain states. You have the Pueblo communities in the Southwest who are very village oriented in terms of the way they lived in really tight societies. And then you have the major nations in the Southeast, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, as they would come to be called in the early 1800s: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and the Seminole. And then in the Northeast, of course, you have the mighty Iroquois Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that had some influence on the founding fathers and their articulation and understanding of democracy, of equality, of fraternity, and so on. And then here in Virginia, of course, you've already mentioned the Monica Nation, you have the Rappahannock, you have a number of tribal nations going back to the Powhatan Confederacy, whose people negotiated the earliest treaties that we have with European powers dating back to 1607. And so the variation and the variability among Native governing styles is just enormous. And I'm facing that as I'm diving into this deep research on how we governed. And of course, we don't know, and we will never know exactly how we governed historically because of the arrival of Europeans and the diseases that accompany them, the devastating loss of life that accompanied them with the disease factor. We're all aware of the pandemic that we are suffering from right now. Well, epidemic diseases took a dramatic and mighty toll on Native nations, and the estimate of population loss of some 90% of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, all from the tip of Canada all the way down to the tip of South America. And we know that from population study, if we accept the figure of 7 to 12 million, we know that by the first estimate in the 1860s is that there were about 600,000 Native peoples left. By 1890, which was when our population had bottomed out, the United States did an estimate of, and there were only remaining 250,000 Native peoples left in the entire country. So from 7 to 12 million down to 250,000. So imagine the loss of knowledge, the loss of memory, the loss of values, the loss of institutions. And there's no way that you can recover that. And so the impact of first the so-called discovery of our country and how that translated into the doctrine of discovery, a legal doctrine that continues to inform our status today, elevating the federal government as it's understood by legal scholars and Supreme Court justices to a standard, a level of legal title that is superior to that of the indigenous people. Our rights being reduced because of our so-called having been discovered by Europeans. You go from the discovery doctrine to the disease episode, and then following that, you have the diplomacy that then unfurled, and the negotiation of many hundreds of treaties that were formed during the period of time. And so it was just a mass of activity and affairs going on, and it was all lubricated by the attitudes and the values that Europeans brought with them, and indigenous peoples equipped with their own attitudes and values, trying to cope with the dramatic changes that they were immediately subject to by all the things that were unleashed once colonialism unfurled and began to spread across the continent.
So there's just so much history, and I think that many of our viewers probably have this experience of having learned American history, these little bits of highlights of things that happened. And from my own experience, there's this fascinating blank period from, you've got 1607, something happened with the Pilgrims, and then 1776. That's a very long time, 150 years of development you're describing. And then, of course, from 1776 on, the emergence of the new nation, the new United States. And in many ways, of course, colonial influences impacted how the United States would choose to govern with Native people. And you mentioned the doctrine of discovery. Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about early federal Indian policy, like how that developed and when it began.
Yeah, well, emerging out of the colonial era, you have Benjamin Franklin with the Albany Plan, where he acknowledges the political sophistication of the Haudenosaunee, of the Iroquois people, and said, how is it that 6 nations of ignorant people can organize a confederacy that has them linked in such a way that they ended war, intertribal warfare, and they are now the dominant political actors of a great swath of northeastern America, all the way down to Virginia and parts of North Carolina, my own home state. So we know that was a huge influence. And so we go from that, and then you look at the 1763 Royal Proclamation line that was established by King George in the hopes that they could try to contain settlement while respecting, at least having a measure of respect for the Native nations, both on the east side of the line and western side of the line, because they're trying to centralize political power, because they knew that there was enormous amounts of conflict happening, and the best way to deal with that was to have central control of that situation. But by the time we get to the Declaration of Independence, and of course we know about that important clause in the Declaration where Jefferson, as the author, talks about Native peoples as merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And so that sent a chilling message to indigenous peoples that was one mindset of the Americans as they were getting ready to revolt against King George. And yet 2 years later, in 1778, the United States Congress negotiates its first formal written treaty with the native nation, the Delaware people. And in that treaty, Article 6 has a provision. Article 6 encourages and invites the Delaware to create a native state, and they were invited to have a representative in Congress. So how do we go from being merciless savages who kill everything, and then 2 years later being invited to create an Indian state and have representation? And that was a clause that reappears in several other treaties, including ones with the Cherokee and the Choctaw as well, in 1795, in 1830, and 1835 as well. And so what you really have are these conflicting, ambivalent positions by federal policymakers and lawmakers, understanding that we need to find a way to engage with indigenous peoples, because Spain and France and Russia, even out in California, still had their own designs on North America. And so the United States was trying to find a way to woo Native peoples to negotiate with them, become trading partners and military allies and political relatives with the United States, while at the same time being steeped in an ethnocentric mindset, believing that Native peoples were culturally inferior, that we were spiritually inferior, that we didn't understand the concept of property ownership, and that the doctrine of discovery had given them superior rights to our lands because they were a Christian society. And so you have these ambivalent feelings played out as it did in the Declaration of Independence and first treaty with the Delaware. And so things have been in a state of inconstancy ever since then, with some federal lawmakers, anxious to engage with Native peoples and being willing to invite them to join the American democratic experiment, and others still viewing us as savages and as people who are inferior in various ways. And so there's an inherent tension that has existed since that very beginning time all the way to the present. And so when I look at the Trump administration, the outgoing Trump administration's policies, he was of the mindset of the merciless Indian savage kind of person who believed that Native peoples really are an inferior population, and that treaties were not to be respected, that our lands could be taken, that oil pipelines could go under our territory, whereas other individuals had much more beneficial mindsets. And President-elect Biden has already issued a 15-page policy proposal that's much more steep in the tradition that recognizes Native peoples as the original peoples. And he's going to engage in diplomacy, and he's going to renew the policy of meeting with tribes at the White House once a year, as Obama did during his 8-year term. And so we see these historic ambivalencies continuing to play out even to the present time.
It seems like just such a perfect representation and conversation about a country that has a paradox at its core founding.
Right.
At Monticello, we have this conversation a lot about how is it possible that the man who said all men are created equal could own human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar kind of paradox that Jefferson would hold in him, both a simultaneous admiration for the nobility of American people and the construct of that noble native idea versus the native savage idea. And it plays out just throughout the whole course. One of the things that you said that is very telling, you mentioned the Spanish in the West and the Russians in the West. And of course, part of the mythology of Monticello and the story that we tell here is centered on the Lewis and Clark expedition, this journey to the unknown West. And of course, the reality is that millions of people are living there, and even in the far West, European colonial powers are already there. Not to diminish the actual challenges of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but there was a lot of diplomacy involved.
Mhm.
And they had to tread lightly, as they were, in many cases, grossly outnumbered and far outweighed a military superiority throughout the plains. But the Louisiana Purchase, it helps further this tone. And of course, it opens up much of the center part of the United States of America for that further colonial incursion. So could you talk a little bit about how the Louisiana Purchase helped pave the way for changes in tribal sovereignty?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a Jeffersonian specialist, but I know enough about his policies um, to, and I actually participated in a Lewis and Clark conference a few years ago. Um, and so when I was preparing for our conversation today, I went back and went through some materials about Jefferson. And we know that he had long had an interest in indigenous lands. And one of the positive aspects of Jefferson is that he understood that Native peoples were actually the owners of their own land. So he didn't buy into the doctrine of discovery definition, which holds that Native peoples have no land title whatsoever, or that their land title is somehow inferior to that of whites. He recognized that it belonged to us as the original inhabitants. And so I give him credit for that. Nevertheless, he, as an individual who would become one of the leading founders of the American Republic, knew that American peoples needed additional lands, and so he was certainly willing and pushed and sometimes prodded Native peoples to cede land through various treaties, right? And so he negotiated during his presidency at least 28 treaties, from what I was able to gather, and most of these were land cession treaties. And what's important about Louisiana Purchase, many people are finally coming to understand that when that purchase was made with France, it wasn't land that was exchanged, it was sovereignty or the governance that was exchanged, nothing more, nothing less. Jefferson knew that the indigenous peoples that inhabited that vast swath of land still held title to their territory. And he knew that there were going to have to be many, many treaties negotiated to buy that land from them. And that's what, in fact, happened. And of course, Jefferson also was willing to put pressure on Native peoples to sell their land, right? Because ultimately, he was the president of the United States, which at that time did not include indigenous peoples as part of its citizenry. And that's a critical dimension to remember as well. Even though there were early treaties as early as 1819, where natives were encouraged to become American citizens if they were willing to leave their nation and fully assimilate into the body politic, you could become an American citizen. But the vast majority of Native peoples had no interest in that. They were parts and proud members of their own nations. But Jefferson certainly used a lot of pressure. And at one point, he mentioned in that one letter that he wrote that, Native peoples must be willing to negotiate lands or we will crush them. And so there was that constant pressure as well. So, there was that sense of paternalism. There was a sense that Native peoples are culturally inferior, even though were territorially superior because the land belonged to us. And yet Jefferson was going to use whatever powers he could muster to help Americans continue their expansion west. And if it meant putting pressure on Native peoples to sell lands, whether they wanted to sell them or not, he was not above doing that. And he certainly did that as well. And so the Louisiana Purchase was a huge event because it really did open up Indian country to additional pressures from settlers who were streaming out west. And yet, land was not exchanged, only the sovereignty, because the United States realized that it only had the right to be the preemptive purchaser of any land that a tribe might choose to sell. And so that's how Jefferson understood the doctrine of discovery, that it gave the United States the first purchase rights, the preemptive rights to purchase, but they had to still purchase them from the Native communities whose lands they were moving into.
So the Jefferson wrote several letters where he said similar kinds of things. And one of the ones that you referenced there, which we'll link and put in our comments link for viewers, he writes in 1803. This is an off-cited letter that he wrote to William Henry Harrison, who was then the governor of Indiana Territory, and he was also the superintendent of Indian Affairs. He basically says exactly what you just outlined. They can, Indian people can culturally assimilate, or they can be removed west of the Mississippi River. And he uses that word. And of course, the concept of removal had profound consequences. Could you talk for just a few minutes about this idea of removal and what those consequences were?
Yeah, the removal. Jefferson was an early proponent of that. He wasn't the first proponent, but he certainly saw that Native peoples were going to have to be relocated in order to make additional lands available. And so he, talked about that quite a bit in his writings and in his policies and so on. And ultimately, of course, when conditions arose in the southeastern part of the country, particularly with Andrew Jackson's presidency and the state of Georgia's obstinacy, feeling as if they were entitled to all the lands, including the lands of the Cherokee, whose territory Georgians were now seeking to overrun, particularly once they discovered gold in those territories. And so that set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately culminate in the 1830 Indian Removal Act, in which thousands upon thousands of Native nations were relocated from all points of America, not just the Southeast, but other regions of the country as well. And they were all shipped off to what became Oklahoma and Kansas. What the 5 civilized tribes did for their part was negotiate a series of removal treaties because they knew that they couldn't resist removal. And once the Cherokee cases had been handed down by the Supreme Court, with John Marshall authoring 3 huge cases, Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, which elevates the doctrine of discovery to a status that really did elevate the federal government to a superior proprietary position vis-a-vis Native peoples. And it also eliminated or denied tribes the right to negotiate with other treaty partners that they had long been negotiating with. And then when you get to the 2 Cherokee cases, the one in 1831, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court essentially said that, sorry, Cherokees, you do not have the right to bring a case directly to us because you are not a foreign state. What you are is a domestic dependent community, a domestic dependent nation. And so that case also contains language that would over time reify into the idea that Indians were wards of the government. Marshall used an analogy in there where he said the relationship between tribes and the federal government resembles that of a guardian to a ward. It was a mere analogy that he used in dicta, and yet over time and gradually that expanded and reified. And by the time we get to the 1850s, 1860s, policymakers in Washington, D.C. are referring to tribes as wards. And they were claiming we had always been wards. And yet, interestingly enough, 6 months after the Cherokee case, Marshall then authors the Worcester opinion, Worcester versus Georgia, in which several missionaries had been arrested as having violated Georgia law by moving into Indian country at the Cherokees' invitation and under color of federal law, which was designed to encourage tribes to accept Christianity, accept proselytation. And the Cherokee invited the missionaries there, and Georgia arrests them and says they broke Georgia law and we're going to sentence them to penitentiary. And Marshall finally has the case that he had been waiting to get, and he finally renders the opinion that I think really reflected his real views about natives, is that natives were not domestic or dependent. We were not wards. We were distinct, independent political communities. Treaties were the supreme law of the land, and state laws had no force inside of Indian country. And so that was the opinion that he had always wanted to write, but politics had kept him from writing it. He was fearful of what the Jackson administration would do had he sided too favorably with the Cherokees in the first case. And so he had rendered a political compromise opinion that acknowledged, Native peoples had some rights, and yet not rights that could challenge those of the federal government. And all this is set in motion, of course, by Jefferson's views on removal that generated a lot of support from people who wanted Indians relocated, in part in their minds to save them, right? Because they knew that Native people's immediate exposure to colonizing powers frequently led to their death or their depopulation, whether it's because of diseases or alcohol or settler conflicts or any combination of that. And so it really set in process a chain of events that culminated in that very dark period, the removal period.
I know when we were preparing for this, we said that we could speak to these three legal decisions, this Marshall trilogy, for hours, and I think that's right. I mean, there's so many ways in which this has impacted federal Indian policy 200 years ago and on up through to today. And for many of our viewers, this happens right after Jefferson's death for the most part. This is in the decades that immediately follow Jefferson. But of course, he knew Marshall and he knew Jackson. And if you just sift through some of his writings, you can get some of his opinions on both of those men, which he had things to say about both. And you mentioned, Professor Wilkins, some of the concepts about preserving Native people by moving them west. And my own knowledge on this is almost entirely relegated to the Cherokee Nation, but there were internal divisions, of course, within the Cherokee Nation about the best path forward, which led to political divisions that also still have ramifications today. And then, of course, the Trail of Tears followed.
Right.
And one of the more interesting and complex aspects of this conversation has to do with the ways in which the Cherokees sought to negotiate their survival in light of these colonial pressures. And one of the things that they did is they enslaved African Americans, many of whom traveled with them on the Trail of Tears. And Monticello, of course, is this site of slavery. Over 400 African American people were held in bondage here. And of course, this cultural conflict of Europeans, indigenous Americans, people descended from Africans, and of course, people who come from Asia, people who come later from the South, and Latin Americans. There's just this broad intermixing of people and cultures that develops into who we are today. But slavery had a profound impact, and I was wondering if you could talk about how slavery played either a political or historical role in the development of Indian relations here in the United States.
Yeah, that really is a dynamite topic, both figuratively and more so, because there's always been an inherent tension, particularly for Native peoples in the eastern part of the country, where slavery was such a dominant enterprise that devastated the lives of African peoples. And you're right, the Cherokee and members of the other so-called civilized tribes, the planting class, the elites of those nations, did in fact enslave African Americans. And of course, it's been argued by some scholars that Native peoples treated African slaves better than white slave owners. I'm not familiar with all that literature, but I don't buy that. I do know that the Seminole people of Florida, the very name Seminole itself means runaway slave, because they are an amalgamation of numerous tribes, including runaway slaves who merged to form what became the Seminole Nation. I know Vine Delory, in one of his books, Custard Diet of Your Sins, wrote several chapters talking about this exquisite tension between African Americans and indigenous peoples. But at one point he described African Americans historically. He said they were viewed by white people as draft animals, and Native people were viewed as wild animals. Right? Both were animals in either case, and yet for whites, African Americans were people who were to be kept out of the American social contract. whereas Native peoples, or at least some Native peoples, face constant pressure to be forced into the American social contract. And so there is a sense of a measured inclusion that Native people experience, whereas with African Americans, it was a measured exclusion. They wanted them to remain on the outskirts. But the problem with the African American freedmen, in the case of the 5 civilized tribes, once they mostly were relocated to what became Oklahoma, we bring up to the Civil War, the slave owning leaders of several of those tribes signed treaties with the Confederates, in part because they wanted to keep African Americans enslaved. And as a result of their participation in Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, when the United States negotiated new treaties with them in 1866, one of the provisions of their new treaties said that the tribes had to had to give citizenship to their freed slaves. Slavery had now ended, and as a requirement of negotiating these new treaties, the tribes had to grant citizenship rights to their former slaves. And the tribes did that, but they did it reluctantly. And we see that being played out even right now at the current moment. The Cherokee Nation, beginning in the 1970s, sought to disenfranchise the African American freedmen, the descendants of the freedmen. And the freedmen fought back, and they challenged their disenrollment by the Cherokee Nation. It wound up going through a series of court proceedings. Finally, a federal judge out of Washington, D.C., I think it was in 2017, issued a ruling that said definitively that the Cherokee Nation had to enfranchise and restore citizenship rights to the freedmen. And they did that, and the Cherokee Nation has finally accepted that. So for them, this has finally been resolved. But the Creek people of Oklahoma are still denying full citizenship to African Americans, and they're still facing legal consequences and political consequences because a bill has been introduced just within this current congressional time that would essentially strip the Creek Nation of federal resources unless and until they grant full citizenship to the freedmen descendants. So it's an ongoing battle. And yet simultaneously, when the Black Lives Matter movement erupted this spring and continues, a number of Native peoples joined in as allies. And so when you saw Confederate statues coming down here in Richmond and in other parts of the South, we also saw Columbus statues being torn down as well. And so we have these moments where these deep alliances can be formed between indigenous persons and African Americans, but it doesn't always happen at the governmental level, unfortunately.
So yet again, it seems like a answer and a conversation that's just as complex as every human being is from every other, with so many myriad different distinctions. And I would encourage our viewers here. Jefferson specifically wrote about some of the ideas that Professor Wilkins talked about there in the beginning, with the European dominant view of Africans versus American Indians. And check it out in Query 14 on Notes in the State of Virginia. He speaks specifically to what Professor Wilkins is talking about, the exclusion of African people and the inclusion of American Indian people. And I think that we have time for one last question, and this is just as broad and just as complex, so I'm going to do it to you again. But you've already brought us into it a little bit with the conversation about how some of these ongoing legal battles are still happening, still taking place today, and political unrest throughout the country with the Black Lives Matter movement over the last few years has brought national attention into a broader and more publicly aware version of a discourse about race and what that means. And this has also happened in Indian country with the water protectors at Standing Rock and ongoing conversations about protection of indigenous women throughout the North and the rest of the Indian country throughout. I'm curious if we could end just by having a bit of a conversation about bringing this history forward just a little bit more about tribal relations today. are there ways in which the history that we've talked about plays out today that you think are important for our viewers and for all Americans to know and to understand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I would emphasize is that for Native nations, the concept of nation itself is critical because Native peoples who live in or on reservations and their governments, which pre-existed the United States formation. We were not parties to the construction of the U.S. Constitution, and our nations are still not subject in general to the U.S. Constitution proper. And a lot of Americans don't understand that. They assume that the U.S. Constitution applies uniformly across every corner of America, but it doesn't apply in the same way to Indian people in Indian country because of our pre-existing sovereignty. And that national identity that Native peoples embrace and are very proud of, it traces back because it was formally recognized by Jefferson and by the early founders and by even going into the colonial era, or the clear recognition that Native peoples are separate sovereign governments. And we must deal with them diplomatically through the negotiation of treaties and the ongoing importance of treaties. Because while treaty making ended in 1871, technically, the treaty rights that had previously been established they still govern. And most treaties, even though provisions of every treaty have been violated by the federal government, very few treaties in toto have been abrogated. So that indigenous peoples, our rights are protected not so much by the Constitution as they are by the treaties that were negotiated. And that certainly has its origin in the colonial and early American period that Jefferson represented. And then the other thing that continues to resonate, and it also traces back to things we talked about at the beginning of today's conversation, this tension between federal lawmakers who, on the one hand, support at times the inherent rights of Native peoples, their rights to land ownership, their rights to be self-governing, to be self-determined, and yet at the same time, a sense that the federal government knows what's best for Natives. As the idea of wardship, even though it's no longer a legal doctrine, there's still a political mindset that many federal policymakers have, that Native people still need a paternal father to oversee them because they're still viewed as somehow culturally or legally incompetent. And so that tension still persists in the law, and it traces back to those early documents that we talked about, with the way we're depicted in the Declaration of Independence, as opposed to the first treaty provision in the Delaware Treaty, which invites the Delaware to have representation in the U.S. Congress. So you have that ambivalence that continues to be a problem, and the fact of citizenship itself, right? Native peoples have 3 layers of citizenship. I'm a member and a citizen of the Lumbee Nation, and I'm also now a citizen of the state of Virginia, and I'm also a citizen of the federal government. And so I always tell my students, in theory, Native individuals should be the most protected class of people in the country, layered with 3 layers of citizenship. And yet, because of our indigenous citizenship, the federal government claims that it can do things to us by wielding virtually absolute political power that's vested in the Congress because of the Commerce Clause that leaves us without any recourse. So even though we are armed with all these layers of citizenship, our rights are subject and are more tenuous and are more attenuated than those of any other group in this country. And again, that all traces back to the early Jeffersonian period. Yeah.
That's fascinating, and just makes me remember and want to underscore again that, as with every conversation we have here at Monticello, it might be about the past, but it's not really about the past.
Right. Exactly.
It helps us understand so much more about where we are today and where we still might go.
Right. Right.
Well, Professor Wilkins, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for just enlightening all of us with this conversation, giving us a lot more to think about and to study. And I hope that this is, as I referenced in the beginning, just the very beginning of what might be a long conversation for us at Monticello and for many people around the United States and the world. Look forward to seeing your book when it comes out, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again soon. And for our viewers, thank you again for joining us for another Monticello live stream. Please tune in next week. We're going to do a behind the scenes peek of the second and third floors of the house and talk a little bit about some of the lives of the people who lived at Monticello there and some of the physical restoration of the space itself. As always, thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.